Hey everybody, welcome back. Africa's a Country, AIAC Live, sorry, I always mess this up, AIAC Talk. So we're back, this is episode 5. I'm Sean Jacobs, I'm the editor of Africa's a Country, and with me I have my co-host, Shoki, who is our staff writer and based in Johannesburg. And I just want to, I just had a little glitch there. And you're watching us live on Facebook and YouTube. So you can watch us on YouTube. You can also, I know some people are tuning in by Facebook. What I want you to do is, if you like what we're talking about, if you have a question, you can just write it in the comments in the live on YouTube as well as on Facebook. And the producer will put it on the screen, our producer Antoinette. And we will try to get our guests to answer your questions. So as I said, Sean Jacobs, I'm hosting the show. This is episode 5. My co-host, Shoki, staff writer based in Joburg. And with us is Saeed Husaini. He's the guy you see in the middle with the earphones on. He has a PhD at the University of Oxford. We always do this to our guests. We embarrass them at the beginning. He's based in Lagos. And I'm reading this off his Twitter bio. And he studies ideology in Nigerian African politics, and his next project. So we are going to talk about Nigerian politics, but I like also the second part of his bio. It says his next project is what's left of the Nigerian left. So we're going to try to cover both these topics in the next hour. Will's shaking his head. He's excited for this. So first up, though, what we always do when we start out is we start by asking our guests, and we also contribute to this question. What are you reading right now? And Saeed, you can, whether it's a book or whether it is an article that you're reading on the web, just what is it that you're reading right now that's occupying your mind right now?
Firstly, I should say thanks for having me on the show. I've been following it since it started off, and obviously I'm a fan of your writing, Africa as a Country, both of you. So it's a great honor to be on. In terms of readings, I've been kind of starting out my literature review for the What's Left of the Left project. So I've been reading around a few different kind of buckets of topics, and one that's been sort of sparking my interest recent is around Islam and decolonization in Nigeria and in the Sahel region of West Africa. So actually, I just read an interesting paper from a journal entitled, or the paper was entitled, Islam and Decolonization in Africa, the Political Engagement of a West African Muslim Community. And it's by a scholar called Zachary Valentine Wright, who's at Northwestern University. And it's quite an interesting paper focused on the life of, the political thought, actually, of a Senegalese Sufi Muslim cleric called Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. And folks who follow Nigeria will maybe have encountered Niasse either directly or just through seeing his stickers on the sort of the rickshaw sort of tiny 3-wheeled bikes that people get into as a form of public transportation, because his photos are kind of ubiquitous in northern Nigeria primarily, but also around the country, for being this sort of symbol of various things, as a religious leader. But one of the things that I've just recently discovered that Niasse has represented is actually a kind of Islamic response to, or Islamic sort of version of anti-colonialism. So Niasse was a big African nationalist and actually was a close kind of friend and even personal sheikh in his own recollection of Kwame Nkrumah. And he was also a Pan-Africanist and an anti-colonialist, and had very interesting thoughts about sort of the future of the post-colonial nation state. So that's been quite fascinating for me, and it sort of opened up a new window of exploration in my studies of Nigerian left around radical Islam, but not perhaps in the way that we tend to think of it. So kind of radical left Islam. So that's been a kind of fascinating, diversion of research.
Is he having conversations with or influenced by the Sufis in Senegal?
In fact, he was a Senegalese religious leader. But one thing that I'm learning about Sahel and about kind of political thinking and political movements in the Sahel is that they often cut across, the countries in that region, in the sort of Sahara region. So even though he was primarily based in Senegal, he was in conversation with political leaders, in Niger, Chad, in northern Nigeria, and was kind of an influential actor in the sort of high period of anti-colonial politics. So, the fact that he's kind of remembered as a personal friend and sheikh to Kwame Nkrumah as well was quite a striking kind of fact for me in thinking through the role that sort of various actors played in decolonization in that period. So I guess, I was struck by the fact that, I hadn't really encountered much about Islamic thinkers that were kind of radical anti-colonialists or kind of radical egalitarians. So that's one I hope to explore some more.
One thing I'll say, this sounds extremely fascinating. One thing that I want to say very quickly is that something I've been thinking about lately is how religion feels like a significant blind spot for the contemporary left. And I've been interested in recovering a lot of the radical thinking in the post-colonial era, which saw religion as a site of struggle and saw emancipatory potential in radical versions of religion, whether it be Islamic thought, Christian thought, Jewish thought. And I think this sounds extremely interesting, but also very worthwhile body of thought to recover. So, thanks for sharing that.
Cool. Yeah.
No, just on this, and I know we got to ask Will quickly what he's reading. We got to move on so we don't get stuck on just talking about religion today like we did last week with football. But it is fine. There's other people, right, who predates this. There's a lot of what people sort of dismiss as, what is it, like millenarian? Like, what is it like, about the millennium, that these people were, it's the end of the 19th, it's the beginning of the 20th century. So these are sort of like people that are out of time, when in fact, a lot of these, as you sort of rightly point out, there's a lot of radical politics that come out of it. There's interesting work by a Jamaican scholar. His name now escapes me, but he's at Brown, and he does a rereading of the anti-colonial struggle in Jamaica by focusing on what he sort of critiques the sort of the nationalism of, the kind of, not liberal nationalism, but suits, Norman Manley, it becomes Norman Manley, Michael Manley, and so on. And then he goes back and looks at these mostly kind of movements based in religions. The Rastas are part of it. Many other churches in Jamaica that actually, as much as they were sort of thinking about the afterlife, they also wanted to live that life now. And often they demanded a lot more from the state than first from the colonial state, but even from these nationalist movements that were emerging, they demanded a lot more accountability, or what they thought this world was going to be like that came after colonialism. But often they were sort of dismissed as they weren't wearing suits and ties. They weren't demanding electoral power or flags, this kind of flag independence. They wanted something more. And so they often got dismissed here. But this is an interesting kind of line of research here.
Yeah. To use
Will, what are you reading?
What I'm reading. Yeah, to use that to talk about what I'm reading. I'm going to re-mention a book I mentioned a few weeks ago. It's called World Making After Empire. It's by Adam Gatatro, who is a professor at the University of Chicago. I'm just going to mention it because Saeed has a great interview with Adam on Jacobin. And the title of the book is World Making After Empire. And I haven't finished it yet, but the argument that Gatatro tries to advance is, she says that the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century weren't merely trying to achieve self-determination for their countries, but were also invested in a project of world making. And what that project of world making meant was trying to reconstruct the international order to embrace principles of freedom, emancipation, and equality. And so what the anti-colonial resistance was simultaneously both a struggle for national self-determination as well as an internationalist struggle to reorder the international community, instead of just viewing it as trying to to integrate them into that international community. And it's a fascinating book. And like I began, you should all check out Saeed's interview on Jacobin with Adam Getachew, where he talks through with her some of the key concepts and arguments of that book.
Thanks a lot for the shout on that one, Will. And actually, this guy is very much a sort of world-making, sort of anti-colonial thinker in that Adam Getachew model in his own way. Sheikh Nias, who I'm studying, so it does tie pretty well into that. Because, I mean, for him, as I was saying, and for a lot of Sahelian kind of religious figures, not to dwell too much on the subject, I know Sean is also keen to move on, but they thought of the.
I'm on
it. Okay, nice. No, I was just saying they thought of kind of community in a much broader sense than the sort of nation state, because the sort of Muslim Tijani or in this Sufi community, of course, extends across these borders. So for someone like Nias, who was a Pan-Africanist, the moment of decolonization where sort of nation-state model triumph was actually a quite disappointing turnout for him. So there's a lot, it seems, to unpack in that period, and kind of very interesting thinking around what the world could have looked like that I think is quite fascinating. And I tried to dig some of this up in the Jacobin conversation with Adam Getachew. So thanks for bringing that one up.
I should mention that there is another article that is a good interview, by the way, the one on Jacobin. But there's on the sort of related subject, we did run an interview a while back by Carlos Fernandez and Suren Pillay with Suleiman. I'm going to mess up his name. The Senegalese philosopher who's at Columbia, Suleiman Danye, I think is his last name, Bashir. And the piece, if people want to look for it, it's called Marxism and Islam in Africa. And the description is that Karl Marx can be useful to people fighting for social justice and who at the same time are deeply religious. And it's basically, Suleiman takes people through kind of post-colonial Senegal and the role of kind of religion. So there are these kind of radical students that emerged in the late 60s. And I'm trying to remember all the detail, but I think they are going back to like older traditions and looking for these connections between sort of radical religious politics or radical Islamic politics and sort of radical leftist politics. Like, are there places where those two things connect? So just on my book, my book is I look so stupid right now because I'm reading a book about football. I'm still reading a book about football. I'm reading this book called, these guys are like, Diaz, he was involved with anti-colonial struggle. Like, this is like this, heavily university press books. And here I come with like, I'm still reading that book about South African football in the 90s. I know Saeed would disagree with me that was not the greatest period of South African football, because Nigeria, in that African Nations Cup that South Africa won, Nigeria was banned from that cup for good reasons. I mean, that's because Sani Abacha had Ken Saro-Wiwa executed, and for that reason they were disinvited from the Cup of Nations. But I know there's a lot of older Nigerian football players like Kanu, Okocha, who will go on and on about how in Keshi, while he was alive, that like South Africa won champions because we were the best. But in any case, I'll take the W. Internet say. And the book I'm reading, he's like warming up. He's like ready to take me on.
No, Sean, you said it.
He's called. Hold on, let me just give the book. See, firing up. I can see you firing up. The book I'm reading is called Madiba's Boy, and it's a book about two of the players who were key in that team. Mark Fish, who people know. I mean, I'm not going to repeat what I did last week. I'm not going to say Fish. And the other one is this guy called Lucas Hadebe, who's arguably the second best player in the history of South African football. Google the other one, Benny McCarthy. He's number one. But anyway, the part where I'm at now, which I'm finding really fascinating, the way the book is constructed is like it tells their lives. They're sort of roughly the same age. They were born at the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s. And what's interesting about both of them is like the one is growing up in Soweto, the other one is growing up in kind of white South Africa, working class actually, Pretoria, which is the capital. But the part about that, which I found fascinating, Lucas Radebe is really clean cut. If you know, he played for Leeds, played for Kaizer Chiefs in South Africa, then went to Leeds. And a really clean cut guy, FIFA Fair Play Award, that he's that sort of character, ambassador for South African football. But in the late 1980s, when he's like in his mid to late teens, he actually participated in kind of liberation politics. And I don't know if people can remember, at that time, the whole issue was by the liberation movement was to say, make South Africa ungovernable. So that, that was the phrase. So make it impossible for the police you, for the army to come into the neighborhoods. And Radebe, who was like 14, 15 at the time, is actually involved in self-defense committees, which is these groups that are defending, to defend the community against the police and against proxy armies. There was a group called Inkatha, which is still in parliament, by the way. So he's part of the young people who are defending the community against them. He's also involved in these ad hoc courts, which metes out justice to essentially people who they consider impimpis, which are like sort of traitors, or people that they deem who are criminals. So literally kidnapping people. I mean, vivid descriptions of hitting people. Not he's in the storytelling, he's sitting on drinking a Coke while other people are doing it, but beating people up with shovels. I mean, this is so, again, I'm not surprised because I'm fascinated. That's another project which I want to do at some point about the sort of violent period in South African sport in the 1980s, particularly football. So, for me, this is fascinating stuff. I kind of suspected that. I always worried, like, what was Radebe's relationship to that moment in South African history? And so it's very fascinating. But anyway, I know Saeed wants to go back and disagree about the greatness of that 1996 South African team.
No, Sean, you already admitted that if Nigeria had been, in the cup that year, things might have played out differently. So I think I'll just leave it there.
That is such a form of revisionism. But anyway, we'll let that go. So let's step off that then. So the thing, Will, I was actually before we move on to we want to get specifically into going on, as you said in the promo for this week's episode. We want to go on a journey of Nigerian politics, and I did forget to mention one other very important thing about Saeed before I ask Will this question. Saeed is also a contributing editor of Africa as a Country, and if you go to the website, you can read some of his arguments about the left in Nigeria and the potential for a kind of more progressive politics out of this sort of, this kind of the game of party politics. But we'll get into that in a minute. But Will, there's an article that Will did on the website that's there. It was put up this morning, and I think it's a very important piece. It's about evictions and the way that we talk about evictions of poor people in poor neighborhoods in South Africa. But I think it extends to other places, and I'd like Saeed, if he wants, to also add to this. But Will, can you just set it up, because it starts with the story of a man who gets violently pulled out of his house by what is described in Cape Town as law enforcement officers. But can you just set it up?
Yeah, sure. So the impetus for writing the piece was an incident which happened last week in Khayelitsha, which is a township on the so-called outskirts of the city of Cape Town. And what happened was there was a community of residents occupying a piece of land, and the official story goes, according to the city of Cape Town, they were occupying the piece of land unlawfully, and there was an eviction order that the city of Cape Town obtained, which empowered them to evict those residents. And one of those residents was a man by the name of Bulelani Tolani. And over the course of this eviction, which had included other residents, his eviction happened. His eviction from his home happened while he was naked and wasn't wearing any clothes, and he was violently dragged from outside of his shack, which is, for people who don't understand what that word means, basically a makeshift structure that tries to serve as a home for people out of materials such as corrugated iron, wood, wire, and other materials. So he was violently dragged out of his shack by these law enforcement officers, and what happens afterwards is he's desperately trying to get back into his home because he's naked, and the law enforcement officers try to restrain him, and he manages to very briefly successfully get back inside his shack, after which the people who are responsible for carrying out the eviction proceed to demolish his home after this entire episode. So it's a very difficult video to watch, and it's a video that I think correctly sparked a lot of outrage and uproar, and was widely circulated on social media and inspired responses from a lot of South Africans. And so what's happened over the last few days is various different groups in society trying to sort of control the narrative of how we should understand this eviction. On the one hand, we have the city of Cape Town, which is governed by the Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance is South Africa's official opposition, and they're the only political party that has provincial power. They govern the Western Cape as well. So we have the Democratic Alliance, whose reputation over the years has suffered due to them being notorious for carrying these evictions out in many communities, and particularly doing so in a heartless manner. And one of the reasons why the nature of the evictions carried out by the Democratic Alliance are especially upsetting and especially sort of, I guess, worthy of outrage is that Cape Town is a South African city that has a particularly bad legacy of spatial apartheid. So the city's inequality is perfectly mapped geographically, where you have wealthy suburban areas in which mostly white South Africans live, and poor and disadvantaged areas in which mostly Black and colored South Africans live. So the city of Cape Town tried to control this narrative. They've tried to say that it was a legal eviction order that they've obtained, and the mayor of Cape Town, Dan Plato, has gone so far as to say that Mr. Xolani even deliberately undressed himself in order to embarrass the city over the course of this eviction. And so the DA is trying to control the narrative to exonerate itself from any blame and to defend its actions. And at the same time, the ruling party, the African National Congress, has sort of weaponized this moment to try and portray the Democratic Alliance as being an especially anti-poor administration, an administration that runs contrary to the interests of the majority of South Africans. Becky Cele, for example, who is the current South African Minister of Police, made a personal visit to Mr. Xolani, and has even made statements saying he'll fast track the assault charges which have been lodged against the 4 law enforcement officers who are responsible for this eviction. And effectively then, my piece kind of looks at all of what is happening and tries to make sense of this episode and how people are currently unpacking this episode, this eviction episode. And effectively, the argument that I try to make is to say that there's nothing new about this eviction. First and foremost, this eviction, or evictions rather, in South Africa, evictions are carried out by both the Democratic Alliance as well as the African National Congress. And the way both political parties understand evictions is always to portray the people who are occupying land as being people who are invading that land, which is to say that they have no claim to that land. That land rightfully belongs to the city, and the interests of the city and people who are seeking housing and shelter are antagonistic, is how they understand it to be. As well as to say that when it comes to understanding evictions in South Africa, we should understand evictions and dispossession generally as being a foundational aspect of South Africa's political economy as it's unfolded throughout history. So it's an integral part of the development of South African capitalism. It's intimately linked to our apartheid and colonial past. And it's something that we shouldn't object to only if it's carried out in a particularly egregiously inhumane way, as Mr. Xolani's eviction was, but it's something that we should object to court, because people are being deprived of a home and shelter. And what that deprivation of a home and shelter, I think, represents in the South African context is that denial of citizenship, is expelling people to the margins of society in order to make the general exploitation that exists in that society much more feasible, if the lines of inclusion and exclusion can be made explicit. And the eviction is one way in which the lines of inclusion and exclusion are made explicit. And yeah,
I mean, yeah, I was going to ask, just sort of, Saeed, we know that in Lagos, right, there's a sort of similar process where people, it's called Tarkwa Bay. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is a nice way for us to then move on to Nigeria. But there's been similar processes there. And there was also violence. I remember the scenes of violence when they were also dragging people out of their homes for that. Yeah. And that's ongoing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah. So, I mean, first of all, yeah, great piece, Will. And the incident you're referencing, Sean, in a community called Tarkwa Bay, and a community near Tarkwa Bay called Okunayo, actually happened in January of this year. And what happened was, basically early in the morning, naval officials of the Nigerian Navy showed up to these communities and were firing gunshots in the air, and told residents of these communities that they had about an hour to pack up all of their belongings and leave immediately. And actually, similar to what Will has described in South Africa, I mean, these are fairly sort of common, unfortunately, scenarios in Lagos. So over the course of the past decade, there have been numerous such evictions playing out in similarly quite picturesque, waterfront communities. You can see the picture of Tarkwa Bay over there, and that it's quite a lovely place. But also in various other areas that kind of were marked as sites for redevelopment of various sorts. So in the Nigerian case, what we're witnessing is a similar process whereby, sort of poor, kind of semi-informal dwellers are effectively dispossessed to make room for kind of luxury developments of various sort, or malls, or kind of various sorts of larger scale, kind of more elite focused projects. So it's a trend that unfortunately seems to be kind of accelerating here as pressures over land rights and kind of sort of availability of land increases. But as Will has pointed out, I think it clearly also illustrates the question of who the state thinks it's here to protect, whose interests the state thinks it's here to guard. And it's clearly not the interest of these folks who were given an hour to basically uproot the lives that they built over the course of decades of living in this community. And I mean, there were some pretty facile explanations offered by the state for the evictions. I mean, there was some reference to oil bunkering, which, because this particular community is situated on the site of a major pipeline, there was some criminal activity that went on vis-a-vis the pipeline, but that in no way can justify, and in fact, kind of even from the perspective of the law, does not amount to or grant sanction to this sort of blanket punishment. So yeah, I mean, it was a very tragic moment, and the communities that were displaced basically have been more or less scattered to the winds. There's one or two settlements that have sprung up in other areas where kind of host communities have been generous enough to grant some space for some informal housing. But that this would happen, in a city where there's already a quite dramatic amount of housing shortages, and that this has actually continued to happen even into the period of the COVID-19 lockdown just illustrates again, the point that Will makes of a state who sees its role as protecting the interest of a certain class against that of people who it considers disposable or to be encroaching on lands that it considers valuable. So unfortunately, just this sort of classic process of accumulation by dispossession.
Yeah, and the accumulation by dispossession model to me seems very distinctly present in countries that are characterized by a post-colonial experience emerging from British colonialism, not only here in South Africa, in Kenya, but in Nigeria as well. And I'm sure there are some differences too. So maybe in order to better understand that and to direct the discussion to broadly the state of Nigerian politics, could you give us a sense of Nigeria's politics today? And maybe in order to arrive at that point, could you explain some of the history of Nigeria? Nigeria achieves its independence from Great Britain in 1960, and it moves into a new, exciting and tumultuous, but also sometimes prosperous era of its history. What happens after 1960?
So I think a kind of key difference in two examples of eviction that we're discussing that I think is perhaps a useful entry point into discussing Nigeria's wider politics is the difference in the arms of the state that carried out the eviction. So in the example that you've described now from Cape Town, it was the police, which are integrated into South Africa's wider history and, have been the kind of pointy end of, the apartheid state previously, and also, various kind of aspects of post-apartheid South Africa's kind of interaction with poor and working people. But in Nigeria, we had members of the armed forces. And, to work our way backwards, Nigeria came back to democracy after a period of long-standing military rule in 1999 with the founding of the Fourth Republic, our current democratic era. And actually, this Fourth Republic has been the longest running period of sort of electoral democracy in Nigerian history. It's now lasted for 20 years. And this is the period where actually most of my work takes place, and it's the period I focus on. But, it's been characterized by the continued relevance of the military and of the security sector more generally in a number of ways. I think the most obvious one is the fact that even in the process of beginning the Fourth Republic, the first president to take power, Olusegun Obasanjo, was a former military president. He had actually served as a ruler of the country on the military rule on the two previous occasions. So and that has a kind of paradoxical effect on the shape of democracy going forward. On the one hand, it did mean that, having somebody with this much kind of respect and authority within the military brass meant that he could kind of establish a sort of new order, and he did so through a series of processes that involving kind of degrading some of the more political wings of the military. But it also meant that the military remained quite relevant in politics, and that the sort of process perhaps of going through a kind of say reconciliation or trial or justice process to deal with the role of the military in previous periods of Nigerian history didn't quite play out as much as it could have been. So a lot of the people who were parts of coups in the past, who had ruled as dictators, are still around. In fact, the current president now, 3 or 4 presidents later after the Obasanjo era, is also a former military general. Speaking of President Muhammadu Buhari, the current president. So that kind of specter of the sort of military's participation in politics has never fully kind of left, even though, we've entered into a democratic period. And while on the one hand, that's provided a bit of stability and continuity from the previous era and guarding the interests of those who would see it threatened by kind of more radical forces, a much more radical version of democracy, it's also limited the extent to which sort of broader social forces could participate in this new electoral period. And like I said, this period was preceded by quite actually dictatorial periods of military rule. The kind of primary one right before the Fourth Republic being Sani Abacha, who's already been mentioned in the episode, and he is kind of remembered for a number of pretty horrific measures, but one of the ones that kind of the wider world will probably remember more easily is the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, activist who was fighting for the rights of communities in the oil-producing region of the country called the Niger Delta. But yeah, I mean, the military era, like I said, continues to loom large, but it also was informed by the period that preceded it. These kinds of moments of experimenting with democracy that happened first in the first 5 years after Nigeria's independence in 1960, 1965, roughly. And then again in the 80s when, the military, actually Obasanjo, handed over power to civilian leaders. But one kind of reoccurring issue that continued to plague this sort of experiments with democracy was the question of Nigeria's diversity, right? As a country that has something like 200, has these quite radically different historical traditions of political organization. So in northern Nigeria, you had a kind of emirate system that was embedded in the wider sort of Islamic emirate system that prevailed in the Sahel region of West Africa, while in the south, you had various forms of imperial or chief rule in the southwest, and various forms of actually fairly kind of egalitarian rule, sort of acephalous rule in the southeast of the country. So the colonial state, pulled all of these quite different forms of social and political organization together in the formation of Nigeria, and the question of resolving this, sort of hodgepodge of different cultures and political traditions was not really fully resolved, and in fact continues to be, a kind of obstacle in the formation of a coherent national identity in Nigeria, and was often one of the underlying currents that led to the fall of democracy in the previous periods and the intervention of the military. So, I mean, I've told the story in a slightly disjointed way, going backwards, but
right,
sort of key elements that I want to highlight in the sort of trajectory of Nigerian politics include this sort of figure of the military as both a stabilizing factor, but also a kind of institution that maintains the status quo, various attempts at trying to forge democracy that have been undermined by kind of the politics of ethnicity and the purposeful deployment of that politics by civilian actors. And then, the sort of unresolved question of how we pull together a national identity in the midst of quite dramatically different political traditions and ethnic and socio-cultural backgrounds. And of course, I can say more about how this applies to various aspects of contemporary Nigeria as we go on.
Right. I really like the way you set it up. That was a really nice kind of exposition. And I think, so just to follow up from that, a lot of people would argue that there's like two moments that and I think you've alluded to, and with the first one you say, like, after independence, there's an experiment, and then of course there's the Civil War. So there's a lot of, we've published a lot on this, that the Civil War is a I don't want to call it an original sin, but it's an unresolved issue with regards to, as you said, about the diversity of the country, whether at some point there should be a national conversation about that moment and how to think about that moment, like not necessarily to resolve it if we think about TRCs or truth commissions, but just to have a public conversation about what that moment did to Nigerian politics. And I want to say one other one quickly. The early 1990s is Babangida's experiment, right? He brings in progressives and he tries to like say, well, let me because I might misrepresent it, but there's another opportunity. Let me rephrase it like that. There's another opportunity from the late 80s till the early 90s to reimagine or rethink the basis of the Nigerian state, or like what is Nigerian politics, and then that project also fails. So can you deliberately, because there's another military coup, but can you just say something about that? Because I think for people may not know about those, but those are two key moments also setting the terms of what we have now in Nigeria.
Sure. And I'll limit my comments to the aspects of this that I do know, while not being an expert on kind of the Nigerian civil war or Nigerian sort of history more generally. But I mean, it's true that the civil war, I think, is well characterized as a kind of original sin, because it's, I think, the moment when the sort of post-colonial dream of trying to forge a nation out of this variety of kind of disparate groups starts to fray. And yeah, the Civil War, just in terms of the basic history of it, broke out in 1967 and pitted the kind of breakaway republic by the name of Biafra and led by a military colonel called Odumegu Ojukwu against the rest of Nigeria. And this sort of breakaway republic was located in the southwest of the country. And yeah, I mean, there were fairly sort of progressive aspects to the project, and this is quite a debated area of history, as civil wars tend to be. But there were also fairly kind of repressive aspects of the project as well, because, like I said, the sort of at least symbol and leader of this secessionist movement was himself a military leader. But suffice it to say that the way the Nigerian state responded was kind of throwing everything it had at preventing the movement. And there was a series of massacres and a quite bloody and horrific episode that lasted for 3 years. And by the end of it, the Biafran state effectively collapsed and the war ended. But yeah, I mean, since then, there has barely been really a process of trying to account for what has happened, not to talk of deal with the question of say any form of reparations, because the sort of toll that was borne by particularly people of Igbo ethnic extraction, who were the kind of primary group that were to kind of occupy the Biafran state, along with other minority groups. That the question of the kind of resolving the sort of toll that was borne by that ethnic group in particular has not really been kind of reckoned with historically, even though there's now, at least in some kind of popular discourses, there's now a little more of an interest in thinking through these issues. And there's also kind of recurrent agitations in that part of the country for increased evolution or even secession in the form of movements such as the Indigenous People of Biafra movement, which is a contemporary kind of secessionist movement. So I think that also illustrates the extent to which there's still a lot of lingering kind of questions or memories or feelings of injustice that haven't fully been resolved. So you're right to point that out as one of the key moments, I think, when the sort of Nigerian project was derailed. And yeah, I mean, I think what you're alluding to with the Babangida, in the Babangida era, was a kind of national conference to try to chart out the future of the Nigerian state. And I should say, by the way, that pretty much every military dictatorship in Nigeria has tried to set up one or the other kind of national conversation. But I think part of what undermines these attempts at calling together figures from across the country is, first of all, that can't be a process that's initiated by a military dictator. That has to be a process for it to represent the legitimate aspirations of a diverse set of people. It has to emerge, from those very people, and that's one aspect of the kind of process of trying to forge a nation that hasn't really occurred. So the Babangida example is one where he kind of pulls together a variety of actors to discuss the future of Nigerian politics and to chart out, the way forward. And actually, somehow there managed to be some representation by left intellectuals. At least one kind of socialist thinker, Edwin Madunagu, was part of the Babangida example of this. But what ultimately comes out wasn't really absorbed into the fabric of what Nigeria became afterwards. For the reason you raised, that ultimately that process was also cut short by a coup staged by the Abacha sort of junta. So again, I think the process of trying to forge some sort of basis for national cohesion, even though there have been, one or two attempts or several attempts to do so, it hasn't quite established enough of a basis for kind of consensus around, the future of Nigerian politics and society, I think.
To ask a follow-up question, and maybe this can be a portal into the discussion about contemporary Nigerian politics. But when thinking about the Biafran War, for example, there's a Marxist anthropologist, a Nigerian Marxist anthropologist, Ikenna Nziriro, and he says that the Biafran War shouldn't be thought of as an inter-ethnic conflict, but should be thought of as an inter-class conflict between the Igbo bourgeoisie and the Northerners, right? And I guess my question to you is, when we think about the national question, not only the national question in Nigeria, but the national question throughout the African continent, we often think of it as being the most important question that decides the fate of politics in the polity that we're talking about. How important do you think the national question is to Nigerian politics today? And do you think that sometimes the national question sort of supersedes the question of class and the political economy in Nigeria? Do you think that kind of, in a classic Fanonian critique, you could say, do you think those sort of issues get obscured by the focus on the national question?
Yeah, just pretty very well phrased question. And I do think so. I completely agree with that. And I think Nigeria is actually a good example of, again, to borrow from Fanon, the pitfalls of national consciousness. Because while we've had a series of these conferences, while we've actually even put in place certain institutions to sort of try to balance diversity and try to kind of limit the extent to which ethnic diversity leads to conflict, these institutions have more or less kind of led to the emergence and the kind of solidification of sort of an elite class within every ethnic group in Nigeria, right? Without necessarily broadening the sort of segments of society that have access to power, to decision-making power, or to material power. So that's absolutely, I think, fair to say that the sort of national question has the capacity, and in the case of Nigeria, certainly has occluded other very important conversations, including that of class. But I don't think that's an accident, is the other thing. I think that throughout Nigerian history, we can see kind of deliberate attempts to make the conversation, the political conversation about ethnicity and about how sort of the resources that have come from, well, in the case of Nigeria, particularly its oil wealth, be distributed on ethnic lines. But that, it's clear after 60 years of roughly of experimentation with various models of distributing resources along those lines, that's not done very much to, either create more a sort of more pluralist ethos in the way we carry out our politics, or to reduce poverty, and empower other social actors. So I think that's a very fair point, and Nigeria is definitely a good illustration of how, the sort of returning to this question of how we forge a nation per se doesn't really resolve the question of sort of who, how you can kind of create a more egalitarian social order.
So I'll be quick because I understand that my internet is very bad, and so, but I'll ask my question quickly. To sort of follow up on this question of like what is the nature of Nigerian politics, and how do we move forward? So there has been a number of movements since the resumption of democracy that have tried to, I think, challenge the basis of like rule, or this kind of deal between the two political parties or the different sets of elites. Can you take us just a little bit through that to like the present moment? And if you could highlight things like Occupy Nigeria, like in hindsight, if you could highlight the efforts of Sowore, just kind of set that out for people. And then finally, and I think Sowore was involved in the latest attempt, which is called Revolution Now. Can you just set it? And I think part of this question relates to something that one of the viewers just asked. His name is Noel Isama, and he asks, how do the youth approach politics, particularly ethnic politics and the military? So kind of like, how do you get out of that politics, which you describe as like, that is the nature of the Nigerian state, of Nigerian politics. So how do you get out of it? And there's been these efforts. Just take us through that.
Yeah. So in the Fourth Republic, there have been moments where, we've seen the kind of possibility of the rupture of this consensus that has kind of been, in a way, established kind of quite much more successfully in the Fourth Republic than in previous ones. Because like I said earlier, this is the longest stretch of democracy in Nigerian history. Part of the reason for that is that there has been a kind of balancing act created in the country amongst its various elites emerging from a diversity of ethnic groups around how the resources coming from oil should be shared. And some of the sort of institutions that have been created to secure this consensus include this notion of federal character, which is basically both an institution in the Federal Character Commission, a national institution, and a kind of norm that governs how government jobs and government positions are allocated. And in effect, it's a kind of principle that necessitates that people of various ethnic groups, have to be represented in government. So this has done a bit to sort of create, on the one hand, a kind of elite that has access to these jobs within a variety of ethnic groups. So it stalled the sort of possibility or the some of the tensions that led to conflict in previous eras. But as we were saying, it's also not fundamentally led to much more wider participation and a much more even dispersal of the resources that we have. There have been challenges to this, and I think a primary actor in challenging the status quo has been the Nigerian labor movement, and this is where the example of Occupy is quite relevant. So around 2012, or actually January 2012, there was a kind of mass mobilization to the streets in Nigeria that occurred after the Nigerian government just withdrew a subsidy it had on petroleum products. And the subsidy on petroleum in Nigeria is one of the kind of last remaining, if you want to call it, social welfare programs that the Nigerian government maintains, because it effectively ensures that the sort of poor and working masses can afford slightly cheaper transportation and access to sort of fuel and kerosene, which is used for cooking. So the withdrawal of this subsidy meant that the price of petroleum more or less doubled overnight, and that led to quite massive mobilization. I mean, both by the labor unions who kind of called for nationwide strikes, but also by new social actors, young people who were participating in politics in many cases for the first time. And actually, I remember this moment as perhaps my own kind of political awakening, where I thought, wow, like, you know, for the first time, we're seeing Nigerians step out, for the first time anyway, in the sort of Fourth Republic period, we were seeing Nigerians step out into the street and demand change kind of across the board, both in the patterns of governance that had, you know, become quite corrupt and embedded in sort of, you know, various forms of sort of sharing, to use the Nigerian parlance, but also, you know, more fundamental questions about who should be in power and the way power should be kind of distributed nationally. Ultimately, the conversation was resolved around the subsidy, and the subsidy removal was kind of partially reversed. And then the labor movements ultimately accepted that kind of compromise and ended the strikes. And depending who you asked, I mean, if you ask a lot of the activists who were kind of first, let's say, radicalized by that experience, they found the labor movement's decision to call off the strike to be a sort of betrayal of the wider aims of the Occupy movement. And so if you talk to a lot of the activists around the Shoki movement, which I'll talk about in a second, you know, they found that moment to reflect the kind of neoliberal impulses within the labor movement and the kind of bureaucratization of the structures of labor that maybe aren't as responsive to popular mobilization as they could be. But, you know, I've just been reading recently a piece by Camilla Howland, who's also a contributor to Africa as a Country, around the Occupy protests. And, you know, it's caused me to rethink a little bit that question of labor's role, and kind of acknowledge the fact that for a lot of us, you know, myself and, you know, a lot of the real activists, I think, who have stayed active since then, the Occupy 2012 mobilization was a kind of watershed moment. It, you know, kind of raised the possibility that mass participation can actually move the lever, even if not as far as people wanted. And it also kind of was one of the major chinks in the armor of the PDP, which at the point had governed Nigeria for 16 years, throughout the first 16 years of the Fourth Republic. And I think it's one of, you know, the issues that led to the ultimate defeat of the PDP, which occurred in the 2019 elections when the APC, the All Progressives Congress, the current ruling party, you know, won in this historical election. So even if the Occupy movement did not achieve all of the aims that kind of were tabled at that moment, it did kind of raise new openings that were exploited by various actors. In one case, you know, the opposition party, which now has become the ruling party, but in another case, you know, creating a sort of new consciousness amongst young people about what was possible. Some of that has now fed. Okay. Well, I was just going to touch a little bit on the question of revolution now and the Shoki movement by saying that some of what that kind of agitation around Occupy has now fed into various new forms of trying to present alternatives to, you know, both the PDP, which was ousted in 2015, and the APC, which has more or less replicated the patterns of governance that the PDP kind of set in place. And so this character, Omoyele Sowore, ran for president in the 2019 elections on the platform of a new party called the African Action Congress, which more or less was built out of sort of student movements and student activism of the 80s and 90s, and attempted, even though not fully successfully, to also draw in various kind of labor constituents within the country. And Showore lost in the election, but I think achieved more than any kind of left electoral challenge had in the years, in sort of years of the Fourth Republic that preceded that, and actually went on after the election to call for a major protest, which they dubbed Revolution Now. And that protest movement, was scheduled for August 5th last year. But right before that, Showore himself was abducted by members of the state security services and was jailed basically for 5 months for attempting that movement. And I mean, I guess in some ways you can read his arrest as kind of sense from the folks in power that there was some possibility that the protest would lead to some sort of wider agitation at a point in time when the country had just kind of come out of a pretty severe recession. But at the same time, since then, I think the wider agenda that Showore was trying to put on the table, basically a kind of attempt at bringing young people, sort of further widening the arena for young people to participate in politics. That agenda has more or less kind of been subsumed within the politics and the sort of legal battle around his own case. So, I think the kind of possibilities around that movement at the moment appear to be a little bit in limbo. But I think, yeah, it was kind of one of the most interesting sort of, and to some extent explicitly leftist sort of electoral and protest attempts that we've seen in recent years in Nigeria.
To ask a question, just a quick follow-up question. Do you think that the trajectory from Occupy Nigeria immediately after the 2008 recession to Showore's electoral bid in 2019, do you think it would be fair to characterize that as being Nigeria's experiment with left populism? So the kind of left populism thesis, the basic argument is that, in this era of demobilization, working class demobilization, when we're seeing the decline of traditional left-wing parties, we're seeing the immiseration of classical sites of working class organizations such as trade union, the left populist experiment presents an opportunity for mobilization in an age of demobilization, as some scholars have put it. And basically, the way they try to go about doing that is to try and build as widest as possible a coalition of different forces, different segments of society, to try and sort of mount a counter-hegemonic project. Of course, the difficulty being, which people are starting to kind of engage with now, is that the left populist experiment struggles to sort of institutionalize the formats that is able to generate. So there's a difficulty in terms of making the transition from protest to politics, right? And try and sustain those coalitions that were very difficult to pull together in the first place. Do you think that's a fair assessment in order to try and generalize what happened in Nigeria? Do you think that would be a correct way of describing it? Or do you think that it was much more particular to Nigeria's political conditions in this last decade?
That's a really good question, Will, and it's one I've been kind of thinking through myself while engaging with the wider conversation around the failures and successes of left populism elsewhere. So I think the Showore movement isn't subconsciously plugging into that wider movement, even though it's occurring at roughly the same time. So I think it might be maybe a bit generous to kind of situate them within that trajectory, because they don't appear to sort of self-consciously, at least sort of Showore himself in the way he describes their aims, they don't appear to sort of self-consciously try to locate themselves within that wider left populist moment. Even though I think there are some forces around him, some of the kind of radical student activists and some kind of socialist intellectuals that have been drawn into the movement. do see that possibility. But I think they hadn't even really gotten to the stage of trying to sort of create a left sort of political force beyond Labour, and kind of carry out the sort of strategies and that we've seen with sort of left populist movements elsewhere. So maybe it's something a little more particular to the Nigerian case, because I think the sort of identity that they wanted to highlight and what I think they wanted to foreground is this question of youth participation. You know, it appeared that their movement was primarily centered around giving young people a chance. But as we've seen, like that has its own sort of limitations that I think also reflect some of the difficulties of trying to carry out the left populist project more generally, but I think are also kind of particularly relevant when you think about the various limitations that a kind of youth-focused political movement will confront in Nigeria, including the sort of crackdown by the security forces that we've witnessed in the kind of revolution now hashtag protest moment that occurred.
So one of our viewers, the very well-known Boima, is asking about culture. So I think I just want to ask you, like, set it up. You talked about youth politics and kind of youth-led movements. So of course, culture always seems to be associated with the youth. And in Nigeria, there's always been, and you know this stuff, I think, very well. There's been Fela Kuti as kind of the embodiment of this kind of a style of politics that we associate with Nigeria. So we know that Nigerian music today it's everywhere, right? It's like you walk on a street in Brooklyn and it's Davido. So can you think that the Nigerian musicians of today can play like some kind of role in thinking about a different kind of politics for Nigeria? And then just related to that, everybody's also watching Nollywood. Why isn't it that Nollywood has also stepped into the breach? And if it hasn't, like, why not? Can you just deal? Because I think Boima raises a really important question, which is around culture, around like the role of culture when we think about Nigeria.
Yeah, that's another really interesting line of thinking. And I think, to the question about music first, I mean, it's a kind of very optimistic moment for Nigerian music, and Nigerian musicians are kind of increasingly sort of pushing the boundaries globally. But I think there has, and well, I think, you talk about Davido, but another kind of major act that has increasingly been recognized globally is Burna Boy, right? With his kind of new album, African Giant. I think we're seeing some of the early, let's say, rumblings of kind of political, to use the term loosely, consciousness within Nigerian music, so within sort of mainstream Nigerian music circles. So if you listen to Burna Boy's African Giant, there's a kind of obvious sort of Pan-Africanist strand to a lot of what he's saying. There's a sort of kind of recognition of Black cultural achievements and this desire to sort of be seen as like equal players in the sort of sphere of cultural production. So in that way, there's a bit of a kind of political awakening occurring. And, a few other artists that exemplify this perhaps even more explicitly are people like Fowles, the Bad Guy. I don't know if you've encountered Fowles, but he's actually the son of Femi Falana, who's Showere's one of the lead lawyers in Showere's trial. And Fowles, is very critical of the kind of existing political system and kind of corruption and mismanagement are key themes in his music. And, I remember Africa as a Country actually had a piece on this kind of music video he did, sort of biting to some extent the This Is America video by Childish Gambino, where he had sort of response. This is Nigeria. So there's that kind of culture of critique, and that seems to be developing a little bit more in an industry that traditionally, since the days of Fela Kuti, has been much more known for its kind of celebration of the sort of conspicuous consumption and praise singing for politicians. So I think moving slightly into this period where we're seeing a few more artists emerge critiquing the status quo is some progress. But I think we're yet to see the sort of very radical critiques of the economic status quo that we witnessed in the Fela era. And yeah, it's hard to say exactly why that is. I mean, the sort of incentives of the industry maybe aren't necessarily geared towards people who, both need to be successful and sort of want to critique this sort of capitalist basis of, Nigerian economic organization. So maybe that's part of it. And I think that's also part of the story vis-a-vis Nollywood, that, Nigerian film is massive, and of course it commands a quite substantial audience, both in Nigeria and across Africa. But we've not quite seen yet that kind of critical agenda develop. And I mean, in the case of movies, we have to also acknowledge the role of censorship. So Nigeria's got a quite active censorship board that very much cuts out scenes that don't reflect what it considers to be in the national interest. So for instance, there was a Hollywood film called based off Chimamanda Adichie's Half of the Yellow Sun that came out a couple of years ago. And when it was reviewed by the Nigerian Film and Video Censors Board, they cut out a lot of sort of the more kind of controversial references to the Biafran War in that film. And so I think that's part of the story with Nollywood, that, sort of official censorship does limit the extent to which, you can play with slightly more radical storylines. But I think there's also a bit of a kind of settling into a culture of producing this sort of aspirational, success-driven storylines, kind of morality tales, that talk about how playing by the rules is kind of how you make it. So yeah, I mean, while not being a sort of Nollywood scholar, I think these are some of the issues that come to mind for me that kind of prevent the more sort of politically expansive visions from taking root in a lot of Nigerian cultural production today.
Just for, your quick comment. I mean, it was raised in the questions. Boima drew attention to how, do you think that this new wave of contemporary cultural expression, in terms of thinking about its political possibilities, related to another question that someone asked in the comments, which is to say that, and I think it's a fair thing to point out, is that, Nigeria's literature production has been a mainstay of global culture and has been very radical. And what distinguishes this new wave of contemporary cultural production? I mean, Boima's characterization of it is as a style aesthetic. Do you think that's what it actually is now, or what is the culture that we should be consuming to see these more radical inflections of Nigerian culture, and specifically ones that look inward to critique not only sort of Nigeria's cultural makeup, but also Nigeria's social relations?
Yeah, I mean, there very much is this sort of style aesthetic that seems to be the center of energy and of cultural production at the moment, particularly in music. At the same time, like I was saying, I mean, I think there is a kind of progressive development within Nigerian music where you are seeing a little bit more of this kind of desire to push back. The extent to which that develops, of course, remains to be seen. But music is one place to look, and I think there's some possibility inherent in the trend that we've already seen. And you're right. I mean, literature historically has been, I think, at the forefront of producing slightly new ways of seeing Nigerian society, and I think it remains so now. Of course, Chimamanda gets cited a lot in these sorts of conversations, and I mean, there's sort of limitations to that style of kind of politics, but it also, I think, has opened up space for a lot of new Nigerian actors, new Nigerian writers to be recognized both locally and globally. And, aside from the sort of writers that are writing for kind of diasporic audience or about a kind of diasporic experience, we've also seen writers emerge locally kind of that are trying to situate the narratives in much more grounded experiences of life in Nigeria. So they kind of, even if not explicitly, are telling a slightly different story and sort of infecting kind of public discourse with new metaphors for how you kind of imagine what is possible. And for instance, I really like the book The Fisherman, which is also by Chigozie Obioma, which has also received quite a bit of acclaim outside of Nigeria. But it's one of these books that, in a metaphorical way, opens up a lot of the sort of social questions that you would hope that literature and Nigerian cultural production would deal with. So and I'm sure there are a few other examples, but that's just one that springs to mind. So literature and music, I think, are arenas to continue to watch for kind of seeing the way in which Nigerian cultural production speaks to questions of political, economic, and social order.
But just on that quickly, one of the viewers, Simukai Chigudu, has a question for you, Saeed, saying, what about Seun Kuti? He mounts the economic critique through his music and collaboration with American rappers who do the same, but he says also he's not sure that may be sure of his reach. Can you just comment on that?
Well, that's a really good point there, Simukai, good friend of mine. Thanks for joining. No, Seun Kuti is certainly another example of, and definitely continues that kind of Fela Kuti tradition of mounting a critique. But there's an extent to which, I mean, his music kind of does get sort of absorbed within a lot of kind of Africa-centric communities, particularly in London. So I know, there's a lot of respect for his work there, certainly in America. And as you've said, he's one that does spark the interest of rappers in America, and he can manage those collaborations. But I don't think he's quite broken into, for various reasons, and a lot of that has to do in part with his message, the kind of mainstream Nigerian music scene. So, you will hear like 1,000 Davido songs on the radio, 100 Wizkid and Burna Boy songs, and you might hear one Seun Kuti. So there are those kinds of, let's say, more alternative voices, and they have been for a long time in the Nigerian music scene. Seun Kuti is one of the more popular ones, to do with his background, particularly abroad. But when we're talking about kind of mainstream Nigerian music in terms of what gets radio play, in terms of what is sort of played at the parties, or much more widely circulated within the continent, unfortunately, these guys haven't quite broken into that scene. I mean, Femi Kuti is another one who also, has been quite productive for a number of years. His music also does a lot to challenge the status quo. He also runs, I think, one of the most interesting establishments in Lagos, the New Africa Shrine, which is a club and bar that kind of pays homage to a previous New Africa Shrine that was set up by Fela and then actually demolished by the Nigerian government. And it's a place where people of kind of all backgrounds, mingle, in a very class segregated city like Lagos. It's a place where, you will hang out with and meet with, bus conductors, people on various rungs of the kind of class ladder, and questions of status that sort of predominate in life here in Lagos are somewhat shelved, in the New Africa Shrine, where everyone can get in for about $1. And actually on certain nights, performances by Femi Kuti himself are free. So that sort of culture exists, and I'm happy you brought it up because it's worth also highlighting. But there's a sense to which that kind of oppositional and anti-status quoist element in Nigerian music has partially been sidelined in the mainstream. Sorry, somebody's car alarm seems to have gone off.
We're probably trying to tell us to stop talking and to wrap it up. So
perhaps.
So I have a final question. I mean, you've spoken about Nigeria's rich cultural history and its rich cultural production at the moment, and everyone knows Nigerian name in the production of culture. But part of what this conversation was trying to shed light on is Nigeria's radical history and its radical presence. So maybe a closing to ask you about your book and what you're writing now. What's left of the Nigerian left?
Okay, I think the alarm's just gone off. Maybe the car's been stolen. But yeah, I mean, it's the left in general, I think, in the kind of post-Cold War period. Oh, there it comes again. Sorry. Maybe I'll give it a second and see if it passes. I'm just going to mute for a second and see if it stops. So.
These are things.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it appears
when you live, you cannot predict when you live that car alarm will go off.
Yeah, indeed.
Luckily, I'm in the middle of
Nice. So, I mean, I guess the sort of basic answer to that, and it's an ongoing project. So, I haven't really, I won't give you too many definitive conclusions, but I think for me, a lot is left of the Nigerian left. Even if, we haven't seen a successful electoral challenge from the left, not in the form of the Shori movement or others, we still see a quite vibrant kind of intellectual production from Nigerian academics, sort of left in academic institutions, both locally and in sort of international universities. We still see a quite active labor movement, and this is in many ways Africa's largest sort of labor movement when we talk about Nigeria's organized labor movement in the sort of Nigerian Labor Congress and the Trade Union Congress of Nigeria. And their intervention in the Occupy movement, again, illustrates the extent to which they still are a pretty powerful social actor, even in the period where we tend to think of labor as having been weakened substantially. And we still have, various sort of artistic currents, citing again people like the Kutis, but others that keep the fire burning in many ways, in sort of raising consciousness and in critiquing the status quo. We haven't seen a moment where a lot of these forces cohere into something that mounts a successful or a much more sort of sustained challenge to the status quo. But, in their various locations, we do see like a kind of sustained presence of critique. And so even if the sort of Nigerian left isn't as kind of vibrant or as coherent or as powerful as, a lot of us would hope, I think there's still a lot left of the left. And yeah, like I said, it's one that I'm continuing to investigate. So hopefully I'll have more to say about this, in future write-ups, in the article and elsewhere, in Africa as a country rather, and elsewhere, maybe in book form.
We definitely want to see you more and hear you more in Africa as a country. So I'm going to drop you with the final question, which is a very easy question.
Okay.
If I'm trying to follow Nigerian politics and I come to you and say, give me like 3, 4 sources, 5 sources that I should look at regularly, whether they be things that I watch or people that I can read, like what would you recommend to a reader who doesn't know anything about Nigeria, but once we get to some of the issues that you are trying to raise, I don't want to read Linda Ikeji. You know, so what do I read?
Well, I mean, I think, the probably easiest starting point for a sort of beginner is the mainstream newspapers. So, if you went to Punch, the website for Punch or Premium Times, it give you the sort of basic facts that you need to know about what's happening on a day-to-day basis. But there are a few newer kinds of projects where you can, sort of delve a bit deeper into what's happening through essays and kind of photo explorations. And one that I really like is The Republic, which is a website, The Republic NG, that features a lot of new Nigerian writing, and I think has been quite innovative in the way it incorporates photography and various forms of art. So that's one to check out. If you're interested in more left-leaning politics, there's a Socialist Workers League website, which covers current events in Nigeria from a sort of explicitly left perspective. And then, of course, Africa is a country, when people do submit on Nigeria, we make sure to feature only the best, the finest quality. So, these are just some that spring to mind. But, through exploring some of these ones, I'm sure you can also find links to, the sort of other mediums that they reference. I see you've pulled up The Republic. Like I say, that's a really good one if you want to kind of explore essays and delve a little deeper.
Anyway, we can go on forever because I noticed that in the comments on YouTube, people are sort of waking up and suddenly they have a lot of questions. But we can't ask all the questions. But I have to thank the viewers because they also helped us and directed us in trying to come up with trying to steer the conversation, and that's what we want. I just want to give one. This is like a new thing. I'm going to call it notes. Under notes, I see the one note I want to put is Simokai Chigudu corrected us that the best team, the best African team, was the Zimbabwean team of 1994. We will not. Everybody is. That was a great team. I think that was like Peter. What's his name? Who played for Coventry? I forget. Bruce Grobler, I think, was part of that team. That was a nice team. Takavira. Anyway, we're gonna leave it. I was born then. Say that again.
No, we should stage a debate in Africa as a country to finally settle this question, because I think it's going to follow us throughout this video talk show series.
Well, I think to be frank, we can debate this another time. But I think Egypt, if you take it by the number of competitions you've won, then Egypt is the best team in Africa of all time. If you take it by in terms of just sheer talent, but never lived up to that talent, I'm going to say Nigeria. I don't know if this is a very good characterization, but if you think football field, Nigeria has always, I think, has had the best talent in Africa. South Africa has had its moments. It's not one of the major teams in Africa. I was just trying to say that at that point, South Africa was the best team in Africa, and I want people to accept that and not debate it. But in any case, I don't know where we're going with this. I want to thank our guest, Said Husaini. This was really great. You took us on a nice journey. There were so many other little topics that we could have talked about, the sort of way that there's some parts of the Nigerian elites who want to keep wanting us to go back to the annulment. They can't stop about the annulment. They can't think about the current moment. Others, they just can't talk about that. They just want to talk about Abiola. They get stuck in Abiola. I wanted to talk more about trade unions. You mentioned Camila Huaran's work, which people can read on the website. I also want to shout out, there are a bunch of other people who write about Nigeria very regularly for us. Omaladi Adunbe, who I think you know, he's I think he's a geographer or an anthropologist who's at the University of Michigan, wrote a really good book on oil. There's there's a Noah Chika who writes about film and cinema. An American who writes about Nigerian cinema. So I want to shout out those people. I want to recommend that people should go look at stuff Saeed has written on Africa's country and elsewhere. We've mentioned stuff on Jacobin. We hope to see you back next week again. And I promise, I'm still struggling with my bad internet, but this is only temporary because it's where I'm at the moment for the next couple of weeks. Thank you to our producer, Antoinette Engel. Great production. And we'll see you guys next week. Take it easy. Bye.
Thanks, Sean.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks, Saeed.